Hi, this is Matt's Marxist Garage with a heaping pile of anarchy pizza, but also better known as The Future's a Mixtape. And I'm Matt.
And I'm Jesse, and I'd like a slice, please.
Of anarchy pizza.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about The Circle, Dave Eggers' novel from 2013, recently adapted into a film. And we're going to talk about the circle within the circle and the dystopia of it.
And circling the drain and our obsession with dystopia.
Terminal dystopia syndrome, TDS. We'll talk about this. And also why the film has a fear of black hawks.
Enjoy. I noticed a few weeks ago that you had this book with you called The Circle.
Yeah.
By Dave Eggers. Dave Eggers. Mm-hmm. Eggers?
Eggers as an egged on. He's been egged on his whole life.
And
so he's writing books.
And the Dust Jacket said something about the future and utopia and technology. Mm-hmm. And it clearly looked like it was probably a dystopic novel, but it piqued my interest. I asked you about it, and you said that you were reading it with your
students.
But you also said that you were reading it, you hadn't read it yet, and you're reading it with them. I found that.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know that if I've
So this is something new I've been doing as a teacher. I've been teaching for 17 years, but at UC Riverside, I tend to theme my courses, which is what's happened for a lot of composition classes or courses in general. Rhetoric was typically taught as these isolated genre essay exercises. So in the field of composition, which is broken off, sadly, balkanized from the English department, it's turned into kind of an apprenticeship thing. So essentially, what's happened is that I've themed my courses like a lot of people that teach writing, and I themed my course to internet democracy. So the whole 10-week quarter is based on the...
Oh, so this was part of internet democracy course. Oh,
exactly.
Great.
But the funny thing is, I didn't even know it would so directly talk about democracy. I just thought, well, it's about the internet, and the internet's how we democratically participate. But so for fun, and so I build new experiences, about half of the books I assign I've never read. And I kind of just don't tell students.
That's unique.
It's very unique. Yeah, it's a high wire act.
I never.
It's like Leonardo DiCaprio and Catch Me If You Can. Just read a chapter ahead. And so because my time is so limited, I really don't even have time to read new books.
But that's great. I think that's great.
So about half of the books I've never read, I just assign. They look interesting. And
awesome.
So what happens is there's a genuine infectious excitement for me as a teacher because I'll recycle certain texts just for workload issues, but I'll pop in new ones that I haven't even read. Now, I don't go out of my way because I'm almost embarrassed by this, but I'm admitting it here on podcast, so I guess it's over. But about half the books I put on my syllabus, I haven't read. I just put them on there. And so it's kind of a fan challenge to myself that I'll read them along with the students. And it creates a high wire act where I don't have a pre-assessment about the text, so the students are more on an equal level with me in their interpretation.
That's great. I think that seems...
Yeah, I don't want my class to be repetition. Like,
right.
I'm going to repeat these texts again and again and again.
So have you found some real gems doing that?
And I had some horrible car crashes. I mean, some texts I shouldn't have put in there.
And how was this book in that regard?
This is 40 miles an hour in the third lane with a bag of Cheetos.
Yeah, so I saw this and that you're and so I picked up a copy and
so the book that I'm
too.
Teaching along with this, which is I think perhaps the best science fiction book in the last 15 years, M.T. Anderson's Feed, which sounds strange to make that claim because it's a young adult novel, which everyone derides as kind of trashy and dumb, but it's called Feed, okay. Where the internet's been implanted in the brain.
Oh.
And augmented reality is paramount to the visual spectrum of human society.
You said it's a young adult?
Yeah, it's all the things.
I'm no longer a young adult. Should I read it?
Hunger Games is a modern corollary to 1984, and M.T. Anderson's Feed is a modern corollary to Brave New World.
Oh, okay.
So the way they look at authority, totalitarianism. So M.T. Anderson's book is about a kind of inverted idea of totalitarianism, where the internalized mechanism of dictatorship is inside the consumer soul, whereas in Hunger Games, it's this outside, external, state-based dictatorship. And what's beautiful about M.T. Anderson Feed is it is the natural byproduct of the ideas that were in Brave New World. So I think it is the most important text, and it becomes an allegory of the smartphone. So the internet implanted in the brain what happens with it in the brain when it's implanted is it functions like an allegory about smartphones. And then when the book came out, it was 2002.
And as a tool for the hamster wheel of desire.
Yeah, and distraction and pleasure death, right?
Mm-hmm. Pleasure death.
What Freud would call the pleasure drive, the death drive, right? And, so for the circle, I was just like, well, let's look for something that's not so future forward, that's slightly tilted.
And had you read any other novels by
No,
Dave Eggers?
I was told to read his first book, which was a memoir-ish book called Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, which was a ironic post-irony title.
Right.
And, it fits within the white hipster culture. But it was a genuine book about grief and about taking care of family after tragic family accident. So that was the basis for his career. And he was a young upstart and got a lot of attention for himself. But reading this book makes me feel like he's a watered-down version of David Foster Wallace. So when you read it, I don't feel like it's really driven
pretty
by
watered down.
Oh yeah, exactly.
My read of it.
And once again, this isn't his most celebrated book, and it's the only one I've read. So King of Hologram as a King is more celebrated than this. But he's a prolific writer, and he's, by all accounts, a genuinely nice guy. He's co-founded McSweeney's and Believer. And,
right, which
and does good nonprofit work for helping kids with literacy, and is a genuinely a nice guy. I saw him at the LA Times Book Festival way back when, and it comes off as a really bright, thoughtful guy. And this book kind of reads like a potboiler. I mean, it's a really pulpy book. It doesn't have literary aspirations, and I was expecting some kind of literary aspirational component, and I think there's brief moments in it, but it's a book about technology. And, Wired ripped into this when it came out in 2013. And the title of the Wired article was basically Dave Eggers' The Circle, What the Internet Looks Like If You Don't Understand It. And Graham McMillan wrote this article. Yeah, so Graham McMillan wrote this article in Wired. And the tech community, people that know tech, and certainly that doesn't mean that they were sycophants for all the Silicon Valley profits, but that it just fundamentally doesn't understand the internet like he probably should have. And unlike a much more beautiful and brilliant book by Gary Steingart, Super Sad True Love Story, he didn't do any research for this book. He did no research, and I think he'd said he did no research. He didn't interview anyone at Google or Facebook. He didn't hit the books.
Is this what he said about
it? Mm-hmm.
About writing the book?
Yeah, he did no research on the book, and he wanted to just kind of let his id drive the book, so his imagination of what he thought of Silicon Valley, which is, to me, the core problem with the book is he's from the Bay Area. I mean, he understands the Bay Area intuitively, and you'd think he'd want to see the other side of the world that he's decrying. And Silicon Valley is eating up the bioculture, the heterogeneous aspects of what made the San Francisco a beautiful thing. There's a short film with the famous poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti where he talks about the city being devoured by Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I hadn't read any of his previous work either, although I'm not a big reader of fiction in any way. I really don't read much fiction at all. And I got to say, too, like I was very interested in the premise, the idea set that it seemed to be working with about technology and real near future advancements of technology and utopic ideas around technology and democracy. But I can't say that it really took us anywhere.
It puts up paradigms, but they're so juvenile they don't even seem like paradigms. And I think the book itself wants to have deep comments about technology,
but it really doesn't.
It doesn't, and it ends up seeming like it's a baby boomer.
So I think the idea, like the premise and the ideas that he wanted to talk about, are ripe for exploration.
Theme
and things.
Versus transparency,
exactly.
And so the premise of the book, for folks that haven't heard it or read the book or know very little about it, this book was written in 2013, and it's premised on a kind of 10 to 15 year time lapse, or maybe an alternative version of our own existence, where the circle
is sort of set like right now, kind of. It doesn't.
It mentions Facebook being the dominant, once dominant
Facebook and Google and stuff, but
and that circle has gobbled it up.
Right. So it's sort of like near like the next few years, kind of.
Exactly. So this I think is
it was written in 2013. It was probably talking about 2017.
This is a core problem with the book. Is it doesn't go towards a kind of hyper realist depiction of the current environment, which is deeply researched and imagined future. So it's not pitched towards a kind of crazy, hyped up, exponential future. It's not, Neil Stephenson book, or, it's not, some science fiction book that's just really pitched at a weird angle of the future. And it's neither a hyper-realistic portrait of the current environment. So it's in between this middle part.
Right. Usually a story like this, you crank up some of the components. Like, what if, take this idea to the nth degree. Take everybody having this technology in them to the nth degree.
Yeah.
Right? Or you take one of these things and push it, and it didn't seem like there was anything really pushed.
The two core aspects of science fiction you hear in circles, because I teach a lot of science fiction texts, and it's been an obsession of mine since finishing my PhD dissertation, is science fiction. And it's a genre, I think it's the most important genre of literature right now. And two terms that have to be mentioned is the term extrapolation and cognitive estrangement. Now, extrapolation is a common technique that science fiction authors use as the basis for their creative playpen making, which is that they take an idea and they extrapolate it. Mm-hmm. And the really good science fiction books take lots of different mechanisms and extrapolate in many directions.
Right.
And the more dynamic the book, the more that it's extrapolated all these kinds of trends into the future. And poor science fiction books, idea-wise, tend to just take one thing and extrapolate, but then all these other things have been staggered or static, and it ends up feeling false and implausible. So the great science fiction texts, when they extrapolate however far they want to go into the future centuries, they think out all the probabilities and causal components. So world building is uniquely important for science fiction and fantasy, or what we'll call SF from this point on. And SF is about world building, even more than a novel, even though I think Ursula K. Le Guin famously said that, realism is also fantasy. I mean, the dominant genre of literature is fantasy. You could call it realism, but it's still fiction. It's still an imagination. And the other term is cognitive estrangement, which I think is the most profound assessment you can make of science fiction that makes it unique from other subgenres or genres of art, is that when you use science fiction as both a technique and a process or a method, what it does is it takes this fantasy, and through reading it, you familiarize yourself with it. And so you fundamentally feel this real world that is a fake world, but by reading it, it starts to become more familiar to you, and you take things that you see in your real world to make comparisons. Like if you meet someone from another place, you try to make yourself familiar with them by looking at reference points. And you do this with science fiction that's very strange and weird. You feel estranged, and so you try to make associations to patterns or cultures or institutions or concepts that are in the world that you're living in. But at the time that the book becomes more familiar, what happens is when you put the book down, the world that you live in becomes strange.
Right.
So there's a reversal.
Right. It seems that idea, cognitive estrangement, is a crucial part of being able to put yourself in the shoes of a character who's living in a different world. Right?
Yeah, and this term's developed from
extrapolated version.
Our archetypal critic Darko Suvin, I'll link the article, and it's horribly baroque linguistically. It's all the academic writing that you complain about when you hear about it, but there's parts of it that are incredibly beautiful and compelling and original, because he typed out what science fiction would become when it slowly became more accepted in literary circles.
So, extrapolation, cognitive estrangement, two great concepts for us to have in our back pockets. How does Dave Eggers use them?
And that's the problem with this book, is because is it science fiction or is it not science fiction? Because at certain points it felt science fictional, but never enough to actually make you freak out.
I almost feel, you're saying this, I almost feel that it would have been much more interesting and probably would have made for a more engaging film version to really just do a real life story of one of these companies. So The Circle in the book is a company is a giant tech company. So imagine Google and Apple and Facebook and Uber all got superseded by one mega company that did all of these things and did them.
Have you seen
better.
Werner Herzog's Netflix documentary.
I've watched about half of it, the one about the internet, right?
Yeah. And I think as broad as the scope of that is, he found unique ways to approach the hallucinogenic aspects of the contemporary world better than he did.
Right. It's almost as if you just tell a true story about Facebook or
And
a true story about Google and what it's like
people
working
that
there
do
would be
historical
more.
fiction, like the the Wolf Hall, a book like that, where if you do the actual research, the real world is actually much more crazy and fascinating than what you would have imagined. And people that are dedicated to that genre of literature, they'll say, look, if you do the research, it's going to be far more weird and crazy.
And so he tries to talk about implications for privacy and for democracy and for transparency and
kinship and family and
like
friendship. Celebrity
and healthcare and all very interesting potential areas, but I think not more interesting than reality.
This is the mistake of the book. Before you even open, his decision to not go hyper realistic or not to go truly science fictional is the problem of the book's whole thing. Before he even starts, the idea that I'll make it about the real world, but it'd be slightly tilted and skewed. So I won't write a real science fiction book and take on those demands, and I won't do a hyper realistic
nonfiction
base. I'm going to do a pop boiler, a page turner, and so that is actually before he even writes anything. That's the crucial mistake.
Which I think does a disservice to the ideas, right? I think ultimately that lukewarm approach.
It's essentially a middle brow position,
right? That middle of the road, like the not committing to really committing to either, to any pulling it in any direction in a real way. It's sort of a disservice to what I think he's trying to talk about, which I assume you really want to talk about some serious shit.
Exactly. So if you want to get to thought-provoking conversations and meditations, because a great book isn't one that just turns pages, but also provides these deep pauses where you have to put it down. And I've read some amazing books where there was vast gaps between when I picked it up, but
you had to stop and think.
I was processing,
right?
And it's not as heavily plotted as it wants to be a true page turner. But I did find myself finding it very easy and accessible to read, and I kept reading it largely because it's a screenplay. I mean, it is 90-85% dialogue, and I thought, well, is this going to be made into a film? Because it felt like Dave Eggers, who has once again worked on other films, so he of course did the screenplay for Where the Wild Things Are, and I think the film Away or Going Away. It's a road movie essentially of a young couple that want to find the perfect place to raise their new child. It's got a precious core to it that I can't stand, but there is some real beautiful moments in the film.
And did you know that when you added this to your syllabus for your course at UCR, did you plan to connect it with the theatrical release of the film adaptation?
Oh, and that was the other thing I forgot to mention. I did this with Snowpiercer. We read the French comic books that based on it, and then we actually went to the movie theater. But and all the students went on that one.
You hadn't. This was the same kind of thing you had.
Yeah, and this is really pathetic. It really blew my self-esteem apart because literally no one other than one student came to the movie theater. So I felt like some teacher stalker. Like wait
for this film.
Yeah, it was because I pitched it at a time that was really late on a Sunday. And the reviews are so bad of the film. The reviews are 16% on Rotten Tomatoes. Batman versus Superman outperformed this on Rotten Tomatoes.
Right. So
a Zack Snyder film
in case you missed it, this spring 2017, there's a film adaptation of this novel by Dave Eggers, The Circle, starring Tom Hanks and
Emma Watson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we'll get to that. I think we'll deal with the book.
Yeah, I don't think we want to really spend much time.
It would be fun to tack that on to the end because of how bad it is. But I don't think we'll dwell on it.
Yeah, I don't think we want to dwell on or really dwell on the book.
Well, you could title the film, if I was subtitle it, "Fear of a Black Cock." Is actually the. I'll talk about that later because I'll pull you in to keep you on here. As however pathetic this book discussion becomes, I'll explain myself for saying something outrageous like "Fear of a Black Cock."
Okay, but you better explain.
Exactly. That's the real title.
Yeah, I don't really want this. Hope this conversation isn't just about the book.
So the mistake is this decision to pitch it in this middlebrow way between not being science fiction but not really being hyper realistic depiction of real research.
So I want to try to get to maybe what we didn't find in the novel or in the film adaptation. Obviously,
black dick.
Not besides that, because I'm not sure. I think that was more a thing about the film than the novel.
So
and I want to get to discussing about the ideas that he wanted to get to here, and how that falls into a cultural phenomenon.
But we have to mention the plot. So the plot is
exactly.
The plot is May.
So spoilers. So if you care about spoilers, Matt's going to spoil it right now.
Because once again, it's not great enough of a book to keep and prevent spoilers. Yeah, and so
you make up your own mind. You read the book, make up your own mind. Yeah.
So May is this girl that's from the Bakersfield area.
She's the protagonist.
The protagonist. Yeah. And her name just spells out, small town girl with a sweet name. And May, like mayonnaise.
Wait, isn't there a May in like a Superman comic?
Yeah, it seems kind of place out of time. It almost like a 1950s thing, May, M-A-E. And she comes from a small podunk town out of Bakersfield, a kind of dying town. And she works for a utilities company that's a dead end. It's a cubicle office space nightmare. And she's considered a genius there because everybody is middle-aged and out of touch with the entire world.
She has a bullshit job.
Yep. And we'll talk about that with David Graeber's bullshit jobs and other life experiences. But she has a bullshit job. She has a friend. She went to an expensive private school and is highly in debt, like most millennials, a debt baby, a bank baby of debt. And she's trying to survive with low pay, low options, and a father with failing health, and a family that loves her and which she loves too, but their vested future is in seeing something happen to her. And her friend Annie, who in the book is not Scottish, and she's this
I don't think any of the characters. Some novels in an adaptation they try to cast somebody who bears a resemblance to how the character is described in the book. I don't think any of them bear a resemblance at all to
No, it's a weird retracing, which is even more shocking because Dave Eggers is the co-writer of the screenplay. So,
but it was weird. I have to say, in this point, it was weird to read the novel, knowing or already having the images of the characters, like Tom Hanks and Emma Watson. And so
because
forth.
we saw the trailers for it. I
saw the trailers.
I did too. It did affect my thinking.
It affected. It made us for this sort of dissonance.
I think the only one was Emma Watson and Tom Hanks' character, because it was clearly when you saw the film what those characters represent. Other characters I wasn't sure about, like Annie or Ty. And Ty was a big surprise too. So
get to it.
So essentially Annie, who comes from a Ivy League pedigree, of a family name that dates back to the beginning of the country, and is wealthy, well connected. Everything's easy for her. She does well. May's a scholarship girl that still has debt, but has to do well in her races. Annie does well regardless of what happens. Everyone wants to fuck her. She fucks everyone. She's happy-go-lucky. She does amazing in school. She's just this effortless person that May has genuine envy for.
And she works at this company, The Circle. She's able to get a job, get May, her friend May, a job at The Circle in customer experience, and then the novel spends 300 pages
talking about customer service,
describing her doing this customer experience.
Yeah, job. And it's a one-trick thing that gets played out relentlessly. And I still found myself reading it kind of almost like I was reading an accountant book, because it spends way too much time talking about recounting how laptop screens.
Exactly, how she's trying to manage her score, her rating within the company.
And I thought that was a one aspect of the book, was the idea of wanting to have a perfect score. In the film, she's celebrating the fact that she got 85, and everyone's telling her she got 85, but she's
85 is this customer satisfaction rating
exactly for her, and following up questions when she doesn't get 100%. Anytime you don't get 100%, you try to follow it up to get that 100% on her customer service.
Okay, so take us to the next plot. Get us to the plot points quickly.
What's made The Circle this giant empire is that we've now have a clean, nice internet of this program called True You. Yeah. And True You means that
connected to your
bad things will never happen again, because we know who everyone is, and your identity, your bank account, your websites. You have this one powerful password and we always know who you are on the internet. So anonymity is gone, which of course is
anonymity is gone.
Yeah, it's completely gone. Everybody knows who they are. You can't have any other name than the name that you want. And so some of the benefits of the internet anonymity, which can be beautiful and powerful for people and also horrible and corrosive, is completely gone. And so the troll's begone. And that's the assumption, is that that's the way the internet works. And because the Circle is this omni company, it's just the dominant company.
And there's a lot of celebration about the idea of the campus, which is a part of the mythology of, or the story of these mega tech companies, is that they have these sort of playground campuses that don't look like our normal bureaucratic working day offices. So,
and may increasingly becomes an unreliable narrator that becomes an unreliable narrator that becomes a more unreliable narrator. And that's another problem with the book, is there's not the internal dynamism or conflict or doubt. That she just becomes a cult member of this church of the Circle, and it functions like a religious cult.
Right. And so the plot points moving it forward have to do with the introduction of new technologies.
Such as sea change.
Right. Sea change is...
cameras are put everywhere in the world.
They call this thing that's like these little pint-sized GoPro cameras that you can put everywhere that are networked and have these ultra high quality,
high definition,
high fidelity video streams. And so the whole world is basically covered in a carpet of video cameras, so everything's seen all the time.
And this
it's
idea,
sort of a, Big Brother, total surveillance, both all your activity online, but also just everybody's activity in the real world.
And this is an idea from what are called the three wise men. That Annie's ranked, her friend Annie's ranked 40th in the company. We don't know about the numbers, but beyond that, which is kind of silly. But she's ranked 40th, or she's in the top 40 core of, and ranking is a big part of the company. Everybody's re-ranked. So there's a nice dynamism in the book, because everybody has to be egalitarian and sort of classless, but everybody's constantly ranking each other. And so there's a dilemma where the performance of egalitarian transparency, fairness, solidarity, compassion is being said verbally, but the whole institution is a ranking system. So you're being ranked for performance, you're being ranked with others, there's a ranking within the company. And the three wise men are Stenton, Bailey, and Ty. Ty is this autistic, discenter genius.
He's the tech genius who
that starts the company,
responsible for the whole thing.
And to have a successful IPO,
he's the Job Zuckerberg character.
And to have the successful IPO, he needs to get people that are real world based that can communicate.
Then there's two others.
Stanton,
Eamon Bailey is the ideas guy, the sales guy, the
huggable teddy bear.
He's the huggable teddy bear who's on stage and performing all the tricks, and then Stanton is the
Miami cocaine shark dealer, right? He's the vicious capitalist.
Right.
He would be running a casino, and he's vicious, and he gives he puts the edge into the company, and Bailey provides the public face. And Ty becomes the mythology, this kind of godhead that we can't see.
He's the one you don't see, and
adds to the mystery and mystique of the company. Right. Him not being there makes him mystique.
But the narrative turn, the conflict in the narrative is all centered around this ever expanding idea of completing the circle. So they talk about the notion of the circle as being complete when they have this they know everything. Right, they have every bit of data about you, about every person on the planet, and the conflict that arises from pursuing that idea.
And
that's the crux of it.
And if you see the cover,
is that accurate?
It is. It's they talk about it completing the circle of perfection, because this book is about perfection, or the notion that there's a perfectibility in everyone and everything, and that technology will create the solutions for everything.
Right.
So this is what you call the kind of rah cheerleading of the Silicon Valley community. My problem with the book is that we only see this campus. It's what I call the Marie Antoinette syndrome, which is because it's so internal.
Yeah, what you're saying is in the circle you'd never see outside of the circle. The
gentrification of Mission Area.
Yeah, we don't.
The gentrification, the forced exculpation of the oldest African American bookstore that's happened in San Francisco. Rental control is gone. People being shifted out and being turned out. Cops being called because some kids of color playing soccer when these white guys want to throw around their boomerang because they're from Silicon Valley and feel like they can do that. And so the gentrification isn't really explored in any dynamic sense. And Dave Eggers, who represents the artistic pedigree of San Francisco, this peace treaty that the artistic community used to have with Silicon Valley, where they were at a kind of a respectful distance, they're being eaten up. The artistic community is being eaten up. And we don't see this in the book. We don't actually see the effects of the circle. We're just told that everybody loves the circle.
Yeah, and there's supposed to be some conflict with the other character. What's his name? The boyfriend?
Francis? Or
No. Mercer.
Yeah.
Right. So there's supposed to be some... Mercer's supposed to function as the doubtful critic
and
about these ideas of
Dave Eggers.
Right. Exactly.
Mercer is, I mean, he's
the conscience.
He's 15% hipster, 15% 75%, he's 15% hipster, 85% logger. And so he has he makes like deer antler light chandeliers. Yeah. And he's this critic, ex-boyfriend of hers that lives in the same town and helps her parents and is a good guy, but also very self-righteous.
So he's the one who's supposed to be giving this critique, which is supposed to mirror our current situation, which is like if you're living your whole life in the screen and you have no privacy and you have all the criticisms about our individual and collective lives being taken over by the web and by immersion in our phones and the screen. But there's no depth to that in the book, and I think that's a shame. That's one point where one critical point where sort of missed an opportunity to really talk about why is this a potentially or currently harmful thing for us to be living inside these fantasies in the screen, to be surrendering ourselves to
necessary critiques about the omnipresent worship of this company that can't do wrong.
There. It's sort of implied, but there's nothing.
And she results in terms of reacting to this by going back on a kayak. So one of the things she does that she doesn't tell the company even, she keeps some things private from all the information in social circles she's supposed to be on. That when she's having a crisis, she goes out on a kayak.
Right.
And she used to do this with Mercer, and he's a nature bunny, and they would go out in nature and go hiking. He says, you don't do hiking anymore. You just want to stare at a computer screen.
Right.
And whenever he reacts to her, it gets under her skin, and she tells you how wrong he is. But the actions that she does is actually a consequence of what he's saying.
Right. So because at the circle, and Eamon Bailey, the character played in the film by Tom Hanks, has this notion that to solve the world's problems, we need complete transparency. Right. We need to see all of the information. And it's his push, the Eamon Bailey's character's push in the film to present this idea as an attractive utopic idea, as a path towards salvation, that if we surrender all information
and all privacy,
then we can have a more egalitarian and utopic world. I think
so Mercer's on one end of the spectrum of, I'm going to retreat into the forest and make antler chandeliers,
right,
and I'm just going to go unplug. And each time she tries to pull him back into this internet world, May, he retracts farther. And every time Bailey's goaded on, he pushes farther, and she pushes past him toward the end of the book by going in a much more profoundly radical notion of transparency that he doesn't even bother thinking of. Because she's this cult member, and it sets up a false binary. And so the pitch in the book is Ty, this secretive, mysterious person who we don't know who he is, and
in the book we don't
exactly. And it tries to trick us that she meets this stranger who's older and thin and wears tight pants, and she talks about his tight pants. And
it goes by a different name.
He's an enigmatic, and she meets him at one of the parties, and she's attracted to him. She can't really explain why, other than his tight pants, which are too tight. And it's very obvious that's Ty, because number one, she can't find him anywhere in the circle. And it's very obvious in the book. And I thought that was really lame and embarrassing that he thought this was going to be a great plot twist. My students thought it was a plot twist because they didn't get it, but I got it with an early part. And he's supposed to provide the nuanced break in that binary. He doesn't really provide it.
Right.
I mean, and he needs to be even more
He's
developed than
supposed to
Mercer.
thread the needle between
this
going like this primitivist
totally
route.
private, totally transparent.
Right.
And there's a point in the end of the book where he tries to create a new constitution of some sort, a declaration of internet rights, and it's just not even developed. And they have sex in the bathroom, and it's kind of creepy and weird and funny, and also just childish. Because the sex stuff is interesting potentially, has a novel charm. But I think even more embarrassing and sad is the film adaptation of this.
Yeah, well, that's not even the sex. There's not even any sex in the film.
Yeah, they're at a fun campus with lots of salmon and goat cheese and sushi, and there's no creepy, weird, or any kind of sex. And Francis disappears. We'll talk more about that. But I think more embarrassing and sad, like I said, was that John Boyega, the African-American actor from Star Wars, he takes the place of Ty.
He plays Ty in the film. He plays Ty in the film.
And he's just this weirdly desexualized creature that roams the hallways and doesn't seem to even know how to use the software.
Yeah, and the character is kind of really neutered character.
He's desexualized. Like, where's the black cock? I mean, if they're going to have sex, I mean, let's not make him.
There's no tension.
No, he's just
book
there as some type of diversity body shot. So I mean, it's weird. It's weird because they're trying to keep a diverse cast, but at the same time, with this diverse cast, you've also have to invest in the characters themselves. And Ty is even less developed than he was in the book. Yeah. And there's no sex. The sex scenes with them were kind of interesting. And do they kiss in the film? I mean. It's just like Fear of a Black...
No, it's not even... It's just this total...
So I'm referencing,
paranoia.
Of course, Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet. Here's a Fear of a Black Cock. I mean, he's desexualized completely. And it is weirdly racist in an underground kind of way.
Yeah, it's a shame that's how the film adaptation was.
I mean, if you're going to do casting, make sure the characters actually matter. I mean, Tom Hanks' character works, but I mean, the boyfriend that she has is kind of her backup boyfriend named Francis, who wants to put a chip into the bones of children so they can't be abducted, molested, raped, or murdered.
Like an RFID
his two sisters were murdered and raped and had horrible things happen to them. I mean,
all of this is left out of the film adaptation.
Yeah, exactly. The characters get collapsed like a lot of adaptations. Yeah. So Francis is this guy that just every time he has sex with May, he just can't have intercourse because he just premature ejaculates all over himself and then wants to document it and record it because he's so lucky he got laid. He wants that to be uploaded. And that's an interesting moment. And, it's not her recording it. And somehow she's not part of that conversation. And he says, well, look, there's so much information. No one's going to watch this.
Right. So that's where this is the core idea of the book is about transparency and the company's, this corporation's argument for transparency as the path to a more just future, and the rationalization that the three wise men, specifically the Eamon character, uses to argue for this as the path forward. There's actually there's one. I only made a couple marks of anything in the book that was worth remembering, but there was one thing that I think that there's one sort of exchange that encapsulated it, where Eamon says to May, we would finally be about being transparent. So about having complete transparency. And they go through in the narrative adoption of wearing these cameras and being completely transparent by government officials and representatives and so forth. But they're discussing this idea, and he's trying to make the argument for why this is not having any secrets is the way to go, basically. He says to May, we would finally be compelled to be our best selves, and I think people would be relieved. There would be this phenomenal global sigh of relief. Finally, we can be good. In a world where bad choices are no longer an option, we have no choice but to be good. So the idea there is like, if you're always being watched, you're going to do the right thing. Like, and that's basically the... But we know that you can't be completely transparent because May eventually figures out a way that through a loophole that Bailey doesn't want images or audio of going to the bathroom. Like that's the cutoff point. You could have sex or get your parents get caught. And there's a scene where when she goes fully transparent, we'll talk about later, where her parents are caught, having sex basically with lotion, jerking in her
father off, and the mother and the father are shocked by this recording that's live and open. Bailey's like, no, we can't cut this out. This is part of life. This is part of our goal for transparency. But going to the bathroom, which I think is a metaphor itself, we have to turn off the audio because it's just not clean enough and it's not family enough. But this is the moment where she's able to have conversations with her friend Annie, who's increasingly dissented from this and exhausted because she's flying around different parts of the world cutting deals, and she still needs her privacy.
I think we've covered the plot points and, of the book, and maybe if we dive a little more into the ideas here that it's trying to get to and implications, and how maybe the bigger discussion about these things, that the opportunity I think that was missed here is this is clearly a condition of our time and our current relationship
oversharing
with technology, and didn't seem to say much about that. The narrative, the novel didn't seem to provide a lot of insights into motivations for individuals or for corporations, or any of the social dynamics that happen, or any of the psychology about wanting to broadcast your life.
As May becomes a more and more unreliable character, she strangely becomes more flat as a character. It becomes less interesting with each page because she becomes such a devoted cult worshiper of Bailey's ideas, and even goes beyond his ideas by asking to become completely transparent herself and be recorded for everything. And the dynamic of the book would have been more interesting for these ideas if she was having an internal debate or a real doubt. And the doubt is so fleeting.
She was totally sold on this.
And when she does show doubt, it's through this unacknowledged, unconscious idea of going back to her kayak. And at every moment where she's in a breakdown, she goes back to the kayak, and at one point stealing and being caught with
There's
sea
never
change.
really any breakdown. There's only,
you're right.
It's sort of just like...
It's what we get for breakdown.
There are asides.
Yeah,
as an aside, she has a little bit of this human thing, and from the dialogue, which is mostly just dialogue, like you say, it's sort of reads like a screenplay. She's totally on board. Like she
becomes more of a cheerleader every day.
She drank the Kool-Aid. She's
hardcore.
She's part of this cult,
and that makes her less interesting.
And she even coined the taglines for this.
Secrets are lies. Sharing is caring, which is really depressing because I was saying that at the playground when my kids were being raised is when the kids were fighting over toys, I'd say sharing is caring. But that's one of these Apple moments with Bailey when she gets on the stage talking about secrets are lies, sharing is caring. I'll be a good girl.
Secrets
Bailey.
are lies, sharing is caring, and privacy is theft.
Yeah.
So the
not
idea
property. Not the property of Circle. Where Circle's taken all of your private information and made it property.
The idea there is that people benefit from seeing what other people experience. So you have to broadcast what you're experiencing all the time. And if you don't, you're robbing others of potential experiences and potential knowledge they could have.
And if May doubted this in one serious way or another, it would be more interesting because Bailey, Stenton, and Ty are nowhere to be found in terms of this transparency. Someone always is asking to be transparent other than the company. And that's what makes the book less and less interesting, is as she becomes more and more unreliable, she becomes a flatter and flatter character through the book. There's not complexity, nuance. There's not epiphanies.
So what would be some of the conflicts that she?
Her awareness that Bailey and Stenton or Ty are unwilling to become more transparent. But they're asking politicians to become transparent, because one of the ideas of the book is that to create this utopia, we'll make politicians transparent.
Which I think
which
it wasn't
implausible as hell.
Right, and there was a bit about that wasn't in the novel, but was in the film adaptation that it wasn't great, but I think actually was probably the most clever part of the film adaptation. The very end of it, the endings are entirely different in the two texts.
Oh, and that's tells you how that the author Dave Eggers didn't have his ideas figured out, because the adaptation is so wildly different in terms of message and semiotics that he doesn't really have a lot of faith in what he wrote as a book.
The end of the novel is that May finds out that this
strange guy.
The strange guy in tight pants, as you wanted to emphasize.
She has exciting sex with him, but it's very quick.
Was actually the tech genius Tai, one of the three wise men, but the founders of the company, and that she continues on to push for complete transparency. While in the film, she actually does have a crisis of conscience at the end and makes the turn and tries to get the wise men to
Bailey and Stenton.
become transparent. And
she puts cameras on them on the stage.
Yeah.
So she uses the transparency of the stage to create accountability. Right. And then these emails and private aspects of the company are plastered on the screen, and we have this utopia. And that's kind of cool because I wanted to see that in the book more developed. But that part in the film happens in the last 6.5 minutes. So that turn is so forced.
Yeah.
But I'm like, that's exactly what was missing in the book. Is in the book she's given the option by Tai to read the sheet of paper saying these are the new digital rights for a better society. Not privacy, not transparency,
because she's broadcasting
something in
all
between.
the time.
Exactly, a more just society. And she's like, "Oh no! I'm a cult I'm a cult leader, and I'm also a cult worshiper, and I can't do this." And so she sees Annie in a coma at the end, and she's like, I'm so glad I didn't lose another friend, but we're now in a total dystopia, and everybody's transparent and becoming more and more transparent." And so it's like, well, where does that lead us to as a book? What are the ideas in there? I mean, sure, it maintains its dystopian worldview. It's a dystopian novel, but it becomes a terminal dystopian syndrome scenario that I see so much in our current fiction, and one that Neil Stephenson writes about with innovation starvation. Now, I have deep problems with Stephenson's idea about what the reverse of that would be, i.e., libertarian free markets run amok, but right libertarian free markets run amok. But there is certainly a crisis of the fact that a lot of the science fiction that's been produced post-World War II, but especially after the Vietnam War, is incredibly dystopian, and now it's bled into young adult literature. And I did like the fact that the film had a utopian import at the end, but it was in 6.5 minutes. And so the end is her on a kayak.
Well, it wasn't. I think it's a stretch to say that it was utopian. Like it
has an impulse. It has a trajectory that says that we're going to get the bad guys and make them transparent.
Yeah, all that it had was a turn of the protagonist's conscience.
But it registers on a symbolic level as utopian because she's back on the kayak. She's reclaimed that part of herself, and it shows her with the drone cameras around her kayak. And then we pan out to this screen of other screens of other screens of other things that are recorded. So sea change still exists.
Yeah, but it doesn't get. Yeah, it may suggest that, but in no way does it do what we talk about.
Yes,
like wanting to see more of, which is build out.
It's not authentic, of course. That's part of the critique. Right. It's 6.5 minutes.
Well, and it doesn't because it's just a 6.5 minute turn at the end of a dystopic story. It doesn't build out any sort of vision of a utopic future. And where I think this is the more interesting thing is how, for all the flaws of this, it's not really that important. Like how this is one among a sea of texts that are stories of dystopia.
Well,
or that are dystopian narratives.
Yeah.
And where are utopian narratives in the culture?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to Jesse in a prior conversation that's not on the podcast, which is I had thought about a couple times ago after my dissertation and my tremendous depression after finishing it was the fact that there's no utopian anything. So I was going to do a film class on utopian cinema, and I can't put up a list. There's no utopian cinema.
Yeah, there's not enough material for you to make a comprehensive syllabus of anything.
Of films. Now I can do that for books, but it's pretty threadbare. I mean, utopian as a fiction, as a subgenre within science fiction, is really small. And there's an exceptional debut by Ada Palmer called Too Like the Lightning, which we'll talk about at some point. But you have to go back to the 70s with Ursula K. Le Guin, and Samuel Delaney and Marge Pierce's Woman on the Edge of Time, where there was a triptych of really groundbreaking utopian fiction. And the science fiction genre is so bad that even Neil Stephenson says, I'm part of the problem, so let's try to innovate. And there's a book project called the Hieroglyph Project that's
Hieroglyph. Yeah, you mentioned that before. Yeah,
and I did a review for it on the LA Review of Books, and it's an anthology of portraits of a better future where scientists and science fiction authors are collaborating on using technology to implement utopian or more positive depictions of the future, especially as we face the emergency of the now with the climate crisis, which will, at our growing rate, is going to kill millions of people, and we have to admit to that. And so there's an attempt within the science fiction community to talk about its own starvation of the imagination. And this is The Circle. The book's called The Circle, but we're in a circle of dystopian thinking.
Right.
And if you look at a study that came out recently, like in the 1980s, there was a high percentage of people that thought that we'd have world peace. If you were to go around and ask people, "Hey, are we going to have world peace?"
Right. You'll get all those visualized world peace bumper stickers.
And I would say,
back in the 80s.
If you just talk to Americans, they're the least optimistic generation of people you'd see.
I think there were a lot of children in the 80s who asked for world peace for Christmas.
Yeah. You don't even talk about it. It's just
not even a thing anymore.
It's so beyond the imagination.
That's sad.
No, the America that everyone uses a stereotype as a positive, bright, Spielbergian vision of the world is not there. I mean, I don't see it in my students. I see dissatisfaction, isolation, dislocation. I do see the beginnings of class consciousness and rage at their student debt, but I don't see the motivation or mobilization necessary to take that to fruition where we actually work towards the solutions. And so that's, once again, the part of this podcast is this book is endemic of the culture we live in, which is it's just a circle. It's chasing its own tail.
Down the drain.
It's a snake. It's an Ouroboros, which is the snake that's eating its own tail.
Orbiting the drain.
Yeah. So, we're devouring our future by eating the past, and we're not getting anything out of it. And the book, which is a circle that we're on. It's this is the idea pattern or the geo shape of not being able to commence in a straight line and make a choice and actually take a direction. So this book, while closing the circle, is actually repeating the circle.
Yeah, and I'm not a writer, and I'm not really a literary person, but I am still a little baffled why more folks don't take it upon themselves to move away from this dystopic fetish. It just seems such a fetish of the culture, and in novels and in films and in all the stories in the culture. So
the SF author Bruce Sterling says quite accurately, I think, that the problem with utopian fiction is that, number one, it's hard work to imagine a positive future. You can find thousands of books on the problems of capitalism, but not very few books on where we transition out of that.
Right.
And so building something new is scary and frightening and hard work. But also in the narrative construct, utopia implies that there's no narrative, because narrative involves conflict. It involves character needing something. And, it doesn't have to be, but very often when you talk to authors, it says it makes for good fiction. It prints, it publishes, people buy it. But I don't think it has to be that way. There was a book by Edward Bellamy. Edward Bellamy has a book called Looking Backward. We'll link to this.
Yeah, I just got a copy of that too.
And it started the modern socialist movement in America, where book clubs formed out of this, and the activist organization EPIC, Ending Poverty in California, which worked towards trying to get the first governor elected that was a socialist in California, and started the first wave of smear campaigns in modern politics. The basis was a utopian novel. It was, misplaced and bafflingly silly assumption about centralization, which you see all the time with Marxist assumptions about centralization in general. But Looking Backward was a socialist vision of a future that was better. And people were inspired by the book. I can't say, do we have a book or a movie that's come out in the last 10 years where people felt inspired to be mobilized?
Right. Or sure, maybe there's some stories that are inspiring on, like within the framework of consumer.
Yeah, I'll go to sleep easy tonight.
Right.
Yeah.
But
looking
inspiring in terms of like collective
mobilization,
social mobilization. No, like I can't.
I don't think we've had a film. I mean, there's a couple films that had utopian implications in them. So one of them was a film that was poorly reviewed, but actually better than people thought, which was Michel Gondry's Be Kind, Rewind, which had a really beautiful depiction of community as a collaborative artistic project where the inner city community just makes these films together, and it's not just one director making them. I think we should talk about it probably as a film, but I think it's actually the closest I've seen as a utopian film, and the idea of community as an artistic project. And it's a fascinating film.
What is this lack of this, or this inability to imagine how dramatic conflict can even, and narrative conflict can even happen in a utopic setting is, I think, problematic sign.
Because you can still have conflicts in even a society that's by all accounts utopian. I mean, like we were talking about early, we could have a utopia where we still have celebrity culture, and the conflict is the existence of celebrity.
Right.
So we could have all basic needs met, but some people being loved way more than others.
Write that. Hey, use that as a premise.
As a premise. And I think that is why Ursula K. Le Guin's book, The Dispossessed, written in 1974, is such an amazing book, such a transformational paradigm of a book, because she reinvented and saved utopian fiction from just being tract like verse and essays that are assigned to character dialogue that don't have real plot or ambivalence. And she calls it an ambiguous utopia. And that's the subtitle for The Dispossessed. And it's an imagination, I think, it's an allegory of the anarchist revolution in Barcelona. Like, what if it actually happened on a moon and they were able to go to a moon and not be confronted with authoritarian socialism or ecological capitalism, which is the other part of the matrix in these three worlds. And she talks about actual conflicts and problems in the utopia. And so it's not perfect, but she makes it part of a dynamic flow, that even in a utopian society that's much better than ours, that there's still a push towards a better society, that there's still a problem in the society. And I think it's amazing.
Yeah, it's I don't know how. Maybe there's a problem with the conception of utopia as an absolute, as a state of perfection. When that's not, I don't think that's not what we think at all.
We can use utopia however we want. I mean, Ada Palmer has written in an essay or a blog, I think, on her website, of the author of Too Like the Lightning, an amazing book I highly encourage to read, that there's a difference between utopia and utopian. Mm-hmm. So utopia or an impossible place, we talked about that earlier, utopia, no place, nowhere, but also a euphemism for, good place, the sound of it. But that utopian means that it's not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better. And so by rebroadcasting the genre of Golden Age SF that she does, I think, and mixing up with 18th century philosophy, she imagines a world that's better, but that does have problems. And I think that's what Ursula K. Le Guin made possible if people are willing to take up the charges, which is you can write conflict-based utopian fiction that is riveting but also inspiring.
And I think it feeds into, like I said, the circle. Like, this is part of us, like circling around the drain, and being caught in this circle is, there's no imagination of what art would be, of what creative work would be if there was world peace. Right? Well, we're sort of scared that because of the frictions of our experience, because of the inequalities, because of all of the struggles of our experience, we feel like it's such grist for the mill. It makes such good sausage.
Yes.
Right? It makes such tasty art that we're kind of scared of a better future because we're going to lose that ability. Like, we're going to lose that friction with the world.
We won't have any good stories to talk about to keep us in our seats. And
I really do think that's a serious thing. And I really do think that is
refuse this conception. I mean, the entertainment industrial complex, by and large, by imagining more dystopian futures, gets us off the hook for the dystopian one we live in, because I can say, well, it's like a horror movie. It makes me feel better about the world I live in. So it creates a nuku-nuku blanket, use a Japanese expression of being warm and comfortable, nuku-nuku. It's like a nuku-nuku blanket. And so dystopian fiction says, oh, thank goodness we don't live in Hunger Games. I'm like, what if we actually live in worse than Hunger Games? Yeah. You just don't get it, do you? I mean, we could take you to Bangladesh, or we could take you to Sudan, or we could take you to parts of the world that are, like Colombia, when, especially during the Civil War, when, it was winding up really high, that is every bit of Hunger Games. And so it creates a nuku-nuku blanket complex. As it makes us feel better because we live in a terminal dystopia syndrome where we read and watch about things that are worse than our own world. It comforts us that this isn't so bad, the world we live in, so we don't need to transform it.
Right.
But if we see utopian fiction, utopian cinema, then we're like, oh my God, why can't we have this now?
It makes you feel uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable and angry and like, Why can't I have this? And this is actually why Michael Moore's best film, which no one saw, is Where to Invade Next, because it doesn't talk about polemics.
Yeah, I haven't,
I haven't
watched
seen,
that yet.
Michael Moore got pneumonia and almost died when the film was being released. So he didn't do his Oprah talk. He didn't do a global talk. It kind of lost the currency because everything's so invested in Michael Moore when he releases a film. It's such an individual project. But what he does, which is really interesting, is he goes to different parts of the world, mostly Europe, and there's reasons for that. Largely because, like we were talking about, the poison pyramid's less involved, religion's less involved in some of these things,
right,
and money and politics as well, which we could talk about, and capitalism.
Amazing. The more you can take those three things away from
money and politics and
fabric
religion,
of
exactly. You can
society,
focus on real problems that are core. And so he goes around, and this includes a North African country. I won't mention it just because I think it's worth not giving spoilers, but he goes to several countries and says, who has the best policy outcomes?
Right.
Why are the best on this issue?
Yep.
And so it's entirely solution based, and you go in it and you feel inspired and also angry at the same time, which is a great, beautiful Molotov cocktail for revolution. I'm angry and I'm inspired.
Right.
And so when you watch the film, you're like, oh my God, this is the greatest deprogramming documentary of all time, because it doesn't mention politics. It doesn't mention politics. It doesn't mention politics. It doesn't mention right, left. It just says, where is there less suffering? And how do they do this?
All right. Well, if it is the greatest of all time, I better watch it right away.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think it's his best film because he's been poking at capitalism for years and years, and then eventually did a documentary that was a mess called Capitalism Love Story. But he's been poking at capitalism for a long time in whatever way he has. And at this point, he imagines policy outcomes, solutions, institutional arrangements that are utopian, that we don't have in the U.S., but these other countries do better. And it's not to say that those countries don't have problems. He says, look, I'm just picking the best flowers. Obviously, there's some flowers that are rotten in the countries, but that's not the goal of this documentary.
Right.
So I highly recommend it. We could do a talk on this documentary because I do think it should be seen much more widely. And it could be the basis for a kind of utopian project we could commit to.
And I hope that we collectively can start to create more, if you quote unquote utopian narratives, right? That we can shed this paranoia about
the circle of the circle,
right? That we can get out of this staring down the drain, and as we all sink, right?
Yeah, the circle of the sink,
and being mesmerized by it.
Yeah,
as we go down the shitter.
Yeah, and closing the circle, isn't what we want, because the circle doesn't go anywhere. It retraces its old steps.
Yep. Gets flushed out to sea.
Exactly. And we typically think of circles as positive things, but this circle is the trapped arrangement of repetitions of history.
We want to take back the iconography of the circle and deploy it for positive connotations, which we will talk about later on the podcast. So,
final comments.
Yeah, final comments. We should come back to this idea because I think we spend a good deal of time talking about this text that got us to talking about dystopia and narratives, dystopian and utopian narratives, and the difficulties that we have as collectively in constructing utopic narratives or utopian narratives. And this is a sort of song I think we want to get back to.
Yeah, in
future episodes.
So certainly, I would love to have a discussion on social practice art as well. Like we could talk about that as the visual art spectrum of the world, or visual arts or studio arts. There is a possibility within that genre of art that there's a utopian impulse, and there's people doing social practice art. That's interesting.
Right. Creating stories and producing things for the culture's social practice. So we all better be mindful of what we're creating. We have an outro this week from the future. You may recognize
an implausibly sad one.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, and visit us at thefuturisamicstate.com.
What will the future be like with Donald Trump? Donald Trump.
As Siri, with maybe an Irish accent. I don't know if I programmed that. I may have had to work out a fetish.
All right. Well, hopefully next week we'll have an actual human being do an outro for us. So if you'd like to record an outro and send it to us, we would very much appreciate you doing so. And you can send that to us at thefutureisamixtape@gmail.com. If you'd like to share some of your thoughts on this episode or give us some feedback, tell us what you think about this dystopian obsession that we all have, and why can't we have more utopian stories in the culture? Find us on Twitter at Future Mixtapes and on Facebook at facebook.com/thefutureismixtape.
And we can social network together on Facebook, me and you.
Yeah, you and Matt can be Facebook friends. He's gonna, you contact him on Facebook, he'll be your friend.
The black hole of Facebook, come to me.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, thank you so much, guys.
Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Cheers and chips.